Hanoi, and I was on me and was hit by either missile or anti-aircraft fire. I'm not sure which. And the plane continued straight down. I ejected and broke my leg and both my arms and went into a lake, parachuted into a lake.
That's what you were going for?
Yes. And as you know, Hanoi was very heavily defended with surface there.
It has been almost 18 years since former Navy pilot John McCain parachuted into that small Hanoi lake. Tonight, he will see it again, and the monument the Vietnamese built to commemorate his capture. He also will walk back into the cell where he spent much of his 5.5 years as a prisoner of war. Tonight, John McCain returns to his battlefield as we return to others in the war America did not win. Floyd Thompson spent close to 10 years in Vietnam, 9 of them as a prisoner of war, giving him the rather dubious honor of having been one of the longest-held American prisoners of the Vietnam, or for that matter, any war. Colonel Thompson recently suffered a stroke that was to force his retirement from the Army he loved.
All those names, all those died. That's the same thing. As our friend Good told us, Good.
More than 2.5 million good soldiers, as Colonel Thompson calls them, fought in this nation's most controversial and unpopular war. A war that was to last more than a decade, was never declared, and would not be won. To some, a country, to others, a war. Vietnamese and American veterans alike, always a battlefield. Despite some of the most modern, sophisticated weaponry, from B-52s to laser-guided rockets, one of the best armies America ever sent into combat, here was to suffer the nation's only military defeat. That we lost the war here in Vietnam is hardly in dispute. But does that also mean that we lost on the battlefield, where our young, well-trained, and well-equipped soldiers beaten in battle by an enemy wearing black pajamas and sandals? Was it possible we won the battles, but still lost the war? Tonight, with the help of some of those who were here, we'll look again at what it was American soldiers came here to do, how well or poorly they did it, and perhaps most important, whether America learned from their experience. From that roof up there in April 1975, American Marines were to watch the last U.S. ambassador to Saigon depart, and then a short time later, to hear an unfamiliar order, retreat.
Who can forget the enormous sacrifices of blood, dedication, and treasure that we made in Vietnam? Thousands died, and many more were wounded, imprisoned, or lost. A vast human tragedy has befallen our friends in Vietnam and Cambodia.
And so America left Vietnam in haste and humiliation, an end, some might say, befitting a war that had divided a nation and taken almost 60,000 of its young men. A war that even today is somewhat euphemistically referred to on some cenotaphs as a conflict. Vietnam, the war, exposed America and Americans to a great deal of frustration, uncertainty, eventually a sense of futility.
Rivera, what do you think of this operation? I think it's crazy. It's senseless walking down the road.
The living room war, as it would be called, had millions of spectators who nightly watched the course and the consequences of a war that otherwise was 10,000 miles away. The men they saw being wounded and killed were their own. And what they saw was to sometimes leave them confused. The language created to describe this instant war didn't help. There was a Catch-22 vernacular for the Catch-22 war. Our troops no longer attacked villages. They wasted them. We were going to win the war not by advancing, but by attrition. When we shelled suspected enemy positions, it was called harassment and interdiction. When American shells fell on our own troops, their deaths were attributed to friendly fire. Civilians were described as non-belligerents, and the enemy was called Charlie. Our daily measure of military victories was a rather ghoulish yardstick called the body count. The war was becoming almost as difficult to understand as it was to fight.
I protected myself from going out on body counts because I really didn't want to go on body counts. Number one, you go on body count, soldiers might not be completely dead, and you can still get killed or injured going out there to count. Then you've got to witness, this destruction of this human body, which can be pretty grisly. And if I didn't have to expose myself to it, then I won't.
Even though at one point the number of American servicemen in Vietnam climbed to more than 500,000, a military solution to the conflict seemed no closer or clearer.
Well, in a short answer, which will probably end up on the cutting room floor, is that the strategy of the war was flawed and the tactics were flawed. Now, victory is possible in a war, as a war, however one wants to define it, with flawed strategy if you have appropriate tactics. And similarly, if you have flawed tactics and you have an appropriate strategy, you can win. You can't win when they're both fouled up. And in this case, our strategy was flawed and our tactics were flawed, and there was no way in the world that we could win.
If the men at the top were unclear as to how they should go about winning the war, those at the bottom with rifles could hardly be expected to have the answers either.
I became a squad leader, and I was given a map and a compass, and told that as a matter of routine, given patrols that I would have to run or ambushes that I would have to set and things like that. I was 19 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. It scared me to death to think that someone assumed that I knew more than those other people did. So I routinely did what many, if Vietnam veterans are going to be honest about the experience, and my God, you have to be honest about it, they'll admit to having done what we call sandbagging patrols, where you would simply go out, perhaps 100 meters or so, and call in checkpoints.
It is extremely unlikely that Marine Corps Battalion Sergeant Major Douglas Wildenhouse ever sandbagged a patrol. But even for the career professional soldier, Vietnam was a war that few Marines had been totally prepared for.
When I first came into the Marine Corps, we were conventional warfare strategists. Vietnam was a completely different era for us. So I was in that learning process just like everyone else was. And we were prepared. I think we were prepared the best we could have been. And we had to go through probably a 6 to 8 week, I don't recall now, 6 to 8 week course in Camp Pendleton to prepare us for combat within Vietnam. And we take the ingredients as we learned as a conventional warfare fighter and converted that into to the guerrilla tactics. And it wasn't really that difficult. It was just a matter of being patient. Patience is a virtue in guerrilla warfare.
Sandbagging patrols, or not taking unnecessary chances, became quite common as the war dragged on. Sensing that theirs was becoming little more than a holding action, while the politicians tried to decide how to end the war, more and more men in the field began playing it safe. No one wanted to be the last American killed in Vietnam. Some did seek refuge from the war in drugs or smoking pot, and they added a new term for disobedience to the military lexicon: fragging, the wounding or killing of disliked officers with fragmentation grenades. There were also instances of indiscriminate and unnecessary killing, as America learned at My Lai. And yet, of the 2.5 million men who served in Vietnam, only 24 were convicted of desertion under fire. It must be remembered, of course, that less than a third of all those who went to Vietnam actually ever experienced combat. But still, more medals of honor were awarded in Vietnam than were awarded in either World War I or the Korean War. But even the nation's highest award for bravery could be tarnished by the politics of the war, as former Green Beret Fred Zabatoski discovered following a secret mission into Laos.
Here we are, every professional soldier's epitome of valor, of heroism, Malachi. And my country doesn't really know what took place that day and the sacrifices that took place that day accurately. And the lives that was lost in that mission of Laos. And it does affect you when you go somewhere else and people attempt to honor you or read your citation and they read Vietnam and you know it didn't happen in Vietnam.
For those who did continue to patrol and engage the enemy, even though the politicians were thinking of forfeiting the war, the reasons for going out and the measure of success were not always the same.
When I took my Marines out on patrol, if we got back and someone had not been killed or wounded, I considered that a successful patrol. This body count thing didn't mean anything to me. We killed the enemy when we met them, and we didn't avoid them. But to my way of thinking, a successful patrol was coming back with lives intact, and that didn't happen very often.
As a young lieutenant in Vietnam, Lewis Puller knew perhaps better than most what was expected of a Marine and an American soldier. Son of the Marines' Marine, Lieutenant General Lewis Chesty Puller, the nation's most decorated Marine, the young Puller, with his father's encouragement and blessing, volunteered for the Marines and service in Vietnam. It was an experience he says he shared with a group of teenagers who, by the time he left, looked like men in their 40s, those that survived, that is. Puller obviously was to survive, but just barely. On a search and destroy patrol, he stepped on an enemy mine.
It seemed to me that I was up in the air for a long time, and I thought I could hear some screaming. There was an awful lot of noise, and I came back down. I guess my left shoulder was dislocated. I couldn't move very well. My legs were gone. I didn't know that. I could see that my flak jacket was in tatters. I could see that my right thumb was gone and my little finger was gone. And I thought that looked so peculiar. I was lying on my left hand, so I didn't know what had happened to it. I knew I was going home.
Lying near death in a naval hospital, Lieutenant Puller remembers looking up and seeing his famous father, who just a year earlier had taken him aside to explain the necessity of honor in battle. There were tears in his eyes.
There were a couple of times when I could see that he wanted to ask questions, and he just wasn't able to. So I never got that. I was never able, and it's one of my regrets that I was never able to sit down with him and thrash it through. And I'd love to be able to do that now and find out, for instance, how he felt about what happened to me. I saw the tears, which I saw very rarely, but we weren't really able to get into it. And then he died in 1971, which was just shortly after I got back. So we just weren't able to share that.
Here in Hanoi, reminders of the American military stay in Vietnam are on public display, along with captured or abandoned weapons of other Vietnamese adversaries, the French, more recently the Chinese. Some historians and military experts have said America should have learned from the French experience, that the battlefield tactics taught in America's military academies at the time were not practical for what was to be a guerrilla war, that willpower, not firepower, would be the deciding factor. For American fields of Vietnam were as varied as they were numerous, from the monsoon-swollen rivers of the Delta to the jungle-covered mountains of the Central Highlands. Firepower usually favored the Americans, the terrain, the enemy. One of the rare instances in which both sides faced each other in anything resembling a classic set peace battle was near the small mountain village of Khe Sanh. Although some dispute the analogy, Khe Sanh in many respects resembled the French siege at Dien Bien Phu. America's casualties certainly never matched those of the French, and the outcome was nowhere near as decisive. But the inescapable similarity is that both sieges had political as well as military implications. President Lyndon Johnson was to declare at the height of the 77-day siege that the whole nation, in fact, the whole world, was watching that brave little band of men defending Khe Sanh, and that he never doubted the outcome. The outcome was that after Khe Sanh had secured a special niche for itself in the history books as the single most bombed and shelled military target in modern warfare, the area was abandoned, and both sides walked away claiming victory.
Làm thế nào để hạn chế được cái sự tổn thất?
Although it was unleashed earlier than the Tet Offensive, the attack at Khe Sanh was aimed only at pulling in the United States Marines and the U.S. cavalry, encircling them, keeping them there as a diversion. We never intended to take the base. It was merely a tactic. Khe Sanh, when it was adopted as a tactic in furtherance of this strategy, was a mistake. Because that was not the route of ingress into Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail it was Highway A1A, and it was over there. But it was designed to create a lure to make them come. And they came.
And as many as 6,000 American soldiers were at one time or another waiting for them. Not unlike the manner in which 16,000 French troops waited for the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
We were Marines trained to assault, and we're the assaultees, if you will. It was really very frustrating because you couldn't strike back. You could sit there and take it day in, day out, pounding, and you couldn't deliver anything back. You just couldn't. It was very frustrating feeling.
There was a gallows humor about the place. We would sit there and the rockets would come in, and I remember hearing a tape that one of the fellows had made while we were in the bunkers. And, a series of rockets would come in, 5, 6, 7, and they would impact in our area. And the tape, the one sergeant from one of the platoons say, "Spread them out, one round will get us all."
I mean, they put a barbed wire behind us. I guess they were kind of pushed back. We might get overrun, but about 8 or 9 of us in my squad, and we took an oath amongst ourselves that none of us would leave that trench alive. And if we saw any of us leaving the trench, we'd shoot them ourselves.
We would take casualty. We had one day, 3 days after the siege began, where we were just throwing sandbags in the area, and a 122 millimeter rocket came in and exploded on the floor of a bunker. And 4 guys were killed, and 19 guys were wounded, and there was nothing we could do about it.
Just who got hurt the most at Khe Sanh, the Vietnamese or the Americans, is mostly a matter of whose account of the battle you accept and who you believe won. An American measure of success was the heavy losses inflicted upon the enemy. Some officers put those losses as high as 15,000. A generous estimate, considering enemy strength around Khe Sanh, was generally put at 20,000. For their part, the Vietnamese claimed that despite the superior American firepower and the massive airstrikes, their losses were light. We accept General Tsung's rationale that he was tying up American forces. He used 20,000 to tie up 6,000. If we accept the American account that they killed or wounded 15,000 North Vietnamese, it wasn't enough to slow down the Tet Offensive that followed. For Marines like Jim Hebron and Kevin McCauley, any sense of victory was lost to the continued sense of frustration.
I think, what it is, too, I think part of frustration is that there was no climactic battle up there. It just sort of petered out.
It was feeling of all the people that we had lost. We lost them for no reason. Why was it so important? And yet, if it was so important, why did we then abandon them?
Both sides came away winners. The loser certainly had to be Khe Sanh, the battlefield, the place. That small piece of Vietnam for which both sides seemed willing to pay a high price today is virtually worthless. A landscape forever altered by the artillery of both sides, by the countless B-52 raids, and by the defoliants that denied an enemy ground cover. Khe Sanh remains a battlefield. The refuse of war is still scattered across Vietnam, left to rust, to remind, and sometimes to kill. Even the old McNamara line, an electronic Great Wall that was supposed to keep the enemy above the 17th parallel, today still manages to discourage intruders with its countless unexploded bombs and mines. To the victors and ills of war. And what of the Army that gave Vietnam its victory over the Americans? Today it faces yet another enemy, China, and it pursues a former ally through the jungles of western Cambodia. And there are still thousands of troops from the north stationed throughout the south, there to keep watch over a population that has yet to adequately express its appreciation for having been freed from American domination. Those many thousands of North Vietnamese troops, whose bodies were not bulldozed by the Americans and South Vietnamese into mass graves, today have heroes' headstones in military cemeteries throughout the country. The soldiers of the South, who fought alongside the Americans and later alone against the Army from the North, are not so well remembered. A military cemetery just north of Saigon, that was once a sea of neat white crosses and well-tended graves, is today a neglected and in some locations desecrated resting place for thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers. Soldiers not only denied a monument, but also a nation's gratitude. .48 and a Republican congressman from Arizona still walks with a slight limp. Raising his arms above shoulder height remains difficult. Reminders, not that he needs them, of an October afternoon in 1967 when he was forced to eject from his crippled Skyhawk over Hanoi. The enemy that shot him down also has a reminder of that day, a monument they built next to the lake into which McCain parachuted. The greeting John McCain received this time at Lakeside, however, was a far cry from the angry reception he got in 1967.
How are you? With me?
For John McCain and the more than 700 other American prisoners of war, Vietnam was a different kind of battlefield, one in which they were treated as war criminals, but from which they would return as heroes.
We don't have to turn to our history books for heroes. They're all around us. One who sits among you here tonight epitomized that heroism at the end of the longest imprisonment ever inflicted on men of our armed forces. Who will ever forget that night when we waited for television to bring us the scene of that first plane landing at Clark Field in the Philippines, bringing our POWs home? The plane door opened, and Jeremiah Denton came slowly down the ramp. He caught sight of our flag, saluted it, said, "God bless America," and then thanked us for bringing him home.
For a nation that in a decade had very little to cheer about, the return of the POWs was an event to celebrate, an emotional rallying point for a country conditioned to bad news and talk of defeat. America already had shown its ambivalence about the war by virtually ignoring the return of hundreds of thousands of ground troops. The warriors were being blamed for the war.
Please bear in mind, gentlemen, the only way old Uncle Sam can repay you for your personal property which has been lost is for you to submit a claim to the government for reimbursement.
But they were the only ones given a hero's welcome, later embarrassed most POWs. But theirs had been a long and frequently painful ordeal.
People who are heroes are just those who were in the wrong place and did what was right at the time.
Lieutenant Commander Ralph Gaither spent over 7 years in the wrong place, and although he is uncomfortable with the accolade hero, He and countless others like him saw their prisons simply as extensions of the battlefield.
The Vietnamese considered us as criminals. We were said to be the blackest criminals in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. If it were up to them, we were like the man who shot the president. We were that bad. And they sought to punish us. They did not allow the International Red Cross to come through, any Geneva agreements to be recognized. They tortured us. They beat us. They separated us. They did not allow us to have rank. I was never even called by my own name. Most of the friends over there were tortured and forced to give many, many things that we did not believe and say in order to stay alive, really.
Often, staying alive was about as much as a POW could do. Survival became its own form of resistance. Some men openly disobeyed their captors or violated camp rules, for which they were beaten or placed in isolation, usually both. Jeremiah Denton, now a United States Senator, spent 4 of his 7.5 years of captivity in solitary confinement. Others, like Air Force Major John Dramisi, proved almost impossible to confine. After one escape that ended when Dramisi, dressed as a peasant, was captured in a rice paddy, he did again what the Vietnamese least expected and other POWs saw as impossible. He escaped.
We had peanuts and food and everything that we needed. Knives that we fabricated as well. So
How many of you left on that one?
To Ed Atterbury and myself.
What happened to the other 5 who were in the...
They refused to go.
Did you feel much the loss of them to that?
Somewhat, because in some cases, some were professing to be the John Waynes, and of course, when the time came to make the decision, they were saying it could not be done, and I cannot fault them for that. The chances were that one could not determine what the chances of success were, but in my mind, as a matter of fact, as Ed said, the chances of success warranted the effort.
Attenborough, well, you were both tortured severely upon return.
Yes, that's correct.
Attenborough died of that torture.
That's correct.
And yet you decided to do it again.
That's right.
Again, Dramisi was captured and beaten, and future escapes made impossible.
One of the things that has struck me now, Walter, being right here, is not my own discomfort, but there's a whole lot of guys that died here and didn't have this chance to leave and come back.
Occasionally, prisoners were beaten and placed in solitary confinement, not only for what they did or refused to do, but because of who they were.
4 hours a day.
John McCain was left in a small cell, his injuries untreated for several days, until the Vietnamese learned that he was the son of Admiral John S. McCain, commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific, including those on bombing missions over Hanoi. That prompted the Vietnamese finally to treat his wounds and perhaps even save his life. But having a famous father would not spare him beatings or many months in isolation.
Those shutters were closed always completely. On that wall, there was 2 men next. One of them was my closest friend. His name was Bob Craner. He was now dead. And
He was a friend before.
No, he became a very close friend because I was here alone and had no one to talk to or communicate with. So I used to tap on the wall to him, and he and I became very close during that 2-year period.
Just tapping back?
Yes, tapping back.
Do you hear each other?
Occasionally, yes. We worked out a method for doing that as well.
There would be long periods of isolation for McCain, as there were for most prisoners, and the code of conduct to which all were expected to adhere, that of giving rank, name, and serial number only, required much of men captured in an undeclared war, fought in an environment of legal and moral ambiguities, in which they were treated as criminals rather than as captured soldiers.
What we resented was the mistreatment for the propaganda. I think it's understandable that when an enemy is captured, you try to get military information from him. That's a standard treatment in warfare. What we resented was the attempts to subvert our belief in our country, faith in our government and in our fellow prisoners, and that's where most of the difficulty. That was one of the methods. If you lose faith in the guy who lives next door to you, then you, of course, then are shaken in your own. And that, of course, is why they didn't want us to organize and communicate, because if you can, then your doubts are removed. There's no doubt that all of us were weak from time to time. I was. Unfortunately, not all of us can emulate John Wayne. But I think the overwhelming majority of us did the best we could.
A lot of times about the code of conduct, in Vietnam, I don't know about other wars, but in Vietnam, it was suicide. They were asking us to commit suicide. That's it. That's I think it's the bottom line.
Robert Garwood, captured by the Viet Cong when he was barely 19 years old, stayed behind when the war was over and finally came home at the age of 33 to face charges not only of desertion and collaboration with the enemy, but even of physically abusing other prisoners. A court-martial would find Marine Private Garwood innocent of the most serious charges against him, and for the lesser charges, he was reduced in rank and given a dishonorable discharge. Former Army Sergeant James Daly also returned from a Vietnamese prison camp to face charges of having collaborated with the enemy. A deeply religious man, a conscientious objector, Daly found himself not only in the infantry, but in Vietnam.
If you love your country, you could have run up to see the war be brought to an end, to stop the war, not to be a part of it. And many people ask me that, well, how could you have, made broadcasts while in prison? I said, because the more people know about it, the more people will decide to want to, bring an end to it.
It had been decided in Washington that Daly and others like him, including a number of officers who made anti-war statements but were never charged, had suffered enough, that there was little to be gained in further punishment of a group of men whose conduct in captivity had perhaps been no less ambiguous than the war itself.
When the prisoners, POWs, came home, I thought that we would be accountable for our actions or inactions, how we performed. After all, that was, we were doing what we were expected to do, and the point was that I thought we would be accountable when we returned, but there was no accountability.
The decade that now permits John McCain to put aside, even temporarily, bitterness toward an enemy that once beat and tortured him and took the lives of others, also has allowed him to understand, if not entirely excuse, those in his camp who ceased, in his estimation, to remain soldiers when they became POWs. And in coming back to Vietnam, there are other things, other people he would rather remember.
Standard. I not only think of my friends who didn't return, but I also appreciate more than I have in a long time. There was a great deal of pain, there was a great deal of suffering, a great deal of loneliness. There was also a lot of courage displayed, and a lot of love for one another that I think maybe Americans are uniquely capable of. Now, here. Oops. For you. Tell her it's for her. Yeah.
Vietnam has never provided casualty figures for the years that the two nations were at war. Pham Van Dong, longtime aide to Ho Chi Minh and now Vietnam's prime minister, insists that his country's military casualties were, as he put it, light. He did not say if that meant light in terms of the American estimate or in terms of what his country had expected to lose. U.S. Department of Defense estimates, however, put the number of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers killed at more than 1 million, and at least 3 times that number as having been wounded. In fact, Ho Chi Minh once stated that for every enemy soldier killed, he might lose 10 men, but that it would be the enemy who would tire first of the war. Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement
to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
It was finally going to end. The war, for the Americans at least, would stop. There was, after all, it seemed, a light at the end of that tunnel. America's soldiers could come home. Well, almost all of them. America still had a war in neighboring Cambodia. B-52 bombers that once had flown secret missions over Cambodia now were publicly trying to slow, even if they couldn't halt, another communist takeover in Southeast Asia. But once again, war and controversy were traveling companions for America in Southeast Asia. A growing number of congressmen had wearied of the bombing and wanted it stopped. Unable to issue a direct order ending the missions, Congress voted to cut off the funds that made them possible. As President Nixon entered into a different kind of conflict called Watergate, Congress voted to limit to 90 days a president's ability to commit combat troops abroad without its consent. Politicians wanted no more open-ended, undeclared wars. A lesson had been learned, and it had been learned in Southeast Asia. Textbooks for this lesson are plentiful. The bookshelves of military academies and public libraries already offer a wide range of opinions as to why America lost in Vietnam. From the accounts of retired officers who claim they might have won, if, to the reminders of historians who say America did not, because, to the journals of young soldiers who simply ask, why?
My life, to me, is a pre-Vietnam, a Vietnam, and a post-Vietnam. Given my druthers on the planner, I might have opted for something else. Sure, there's a bitterness there, a personal, selfish bitterness. There's any area you want to touch, there's a bitterness.
I don't think they learned. And they can't learn from an experience like that because they never accepted that it was their own.
I would hope that the Vietnam experience has better defined the role of the military men. I believe when we want to point fingers of blame at who's responsible for the losses that we experienced in the Vietnam War, we must also point a finger at some of our senior military officers, whose memoirs we all now read, who describe in detail how the war was being conducted improperly in a no-win fashion, etc., etc. Why didn't those senior military officers speak up then?
There's always Monday morning quarterbacking over right and wrong, but the serviceman cannot take time for much of that. Real crimes, illegal crimes, obvious things, sure. But when it comes time to go and defend those things or fight for those things that our government, our military has identified as my job, then by God, I'm going to do it.
Where are the leaders of our country? Where is the leadership?
It was a similar belief, answering the nation's call, that sent this young officer to Vietnam, only to have him return much decorated, but even more disillusioned.
Where are they now that we, the men whom they sent off to war, have returned? These are commanders who have deserted their troops. And there is no more serious crime in the law of war. The Army says they never leave their wounded.
You're now a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. How would you react to somebody making that statement to you today?
I'd feel pretty stunned, I would think. They were heartfelt words, felt very deeply at the time, angry words, which I think expressed the feeling of a great many of us who returned, who had a sense that the killing that continued, certainly after a certain period of time, was unnecessary, and that those who had been so certain of our involvement and so ready to see us pursue this effort had somehow disappeared from the debate and were not involved. And I
don't think we learned anything from Vietnam.
I think we've learned some things, but I don't think that all of the lessons are being applied. No, I think that we have certainly learned some things. I mean, certainly the current Congress has a fundamental, visceral reluctance to commit the troops in Central America or to see us get into a situation where that will happen because still of the memories of Vietnam.
The in vogue thing now that you hear everybody say is, well, we've learned that you never get into a war that you're not prepared to go all out and support. Jesus, we should have learned that 300 years ago. That's not a lesson in my mind. That's a catch line that gets applause. But that's not a lesson.
For today's young Marine, the lesson of Vietnam probably is little more than another obstacle they added at basic training. Most of today's recruits were still in grade school when the war ended, and the few admonishments they might hear about the mistakes made in Vietnam are those occasionally barked by drill instructors who might have served there.
Get back on top! Get back on top! Reach!
That's why.
Today's Marine responds more to those who lost their lives in Beirut than to those who fought a losing war in Southeast Asia. Caught up in a new wave of patriotism and attracted to a peacetime military that bills itself as being an occupation rather than an obligation, today's soldier wears his uniform proudly, seems willing to go wherever his commander-in-chief feels he is needed. The military of the 80s has few image or recruitment problems. Although enlistments have dipped slightly in recent months, and some generals have advocated a resumption of the draft to meet manpower needs, America's peacetime military remains popular. It is an atmosphere not unlike that of 25 years ago.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Echoes of that presidential promise can still be heard today.
Our policy is simple. We are not going to betray our friends, reward the enemies of freedom, or permit fear and retreat to become American policies, especially in this hemisphere.
Fortunately, there are no wars, declared or undeclared, to which America has seen troops. There are, however, a number of conflicts around the world that have the interest of the politicians and the attention of the Pentagon. It must be hoped, of course, that America never again will have to fight another Vietnam. Recent history, however, leaves little room for optimism. In the past 80 years, America has fought in 4 wars, winning all but one of them. And yet, ironically, America stands to gain as much from the one war lost as it did from all those won. If in the future there is a greater reluctance to send soldiers off to some uncertain war with obscure objectives, if no war can be considered without the consensus of the American people and government, if the selection of those who must fight future wars is made equitable, if, instead of having both guns and butter, the civilian population is asked to share the cost of that war, then the sacrifice made by the 60,000 American soldiers who died, and out of the many thousands more who were wounded or otherwise scarred by the war, was not entirely. It was 10 years ago this month the war in Vietnam came to an end. A war that took longer to fight than World War I, II, and the Korean War combined. Now it is history. Now it is memories, images.
hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and hit that notification icon for the latest videos as they are released. Thanks for watching and catch you in the next one. Ciao for now.